explain to our audience what grit is?
It's passion and perseverance for long-term goals. But I think it's also loving what you do and staying in love with what you do for the long term. That's passion for long-term goals. That's what grit is.
Hello, this is Dr. William E. Morgan, president of Parker University. And today I have a very special guest, Dr. Angela Duckworth, PhD and author of the best-selling book, Grit. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me here, President Morgan.
So we have a real interest in grit. Can you explain to our audience what grit is?
Grit to me is two things, not one thing, two. It's passion and perseverance for long-term goals. And my emphasis on two things is that a lot of people think what grit is just working hard, is just being resilient, and that's half of grit, that's the perseverance half. But I think it's also loving what you do and staying in love with what you do for the long term. That's passion for long-term goals. That's what grit is.
Being year in, year out, pursuing through hard times, for good times through hard times.
I mean, I think that when people think about, good days and bad days, which we all have, right? I think the way to think about grit is that, it is living life like a marathon and not a sprint. It really is saying, even if I have a bad day or maybe a series of bad days, even on days where I feel underconfidence, like the question is, what do I do after those feelings? I mean, can I stay in the marathon? Can I keep running in this race? And I think that that's what I've determined to be, one of the common denominators of high achievers in every field that I've studied.
Now, I've interviewed Michael Phelps, and one of the things he said that was responsible for his success was he never took a day off. 7 days a week he would train. So is that an example of grit or discipline?
Well, I would say of paragons of grit like Michael Phelps, and by the way, the history books on grit have to include people like Michael Phelps. I mean, he's exactly what I study. I won't say that I understand the physiological side of whether you should or shouldn't take a rest day. So leaving that aside, I do think there is this consistency, this almost obsession with working toward your goals that is characteristic of grit. You know what people who are gritty are? They're not the people who are 9 to 5. They are, it's like Friday night and they're watching a movie, and what they do naturally is to connect what they're seeing to that goal of theirs. It's Sunday at brunch, and again, they're thinking about it. So I'm not saying somebody necessarily has to train 7 days a week, but you're committed 7 days a week. And I think that, to me, is one of the things that makes grit so special. That's not about your talent. That's not about having, any kind of innate gift, but really having that enduring and consistent commitment.
It's like your reticular activating system always working to grab on to things to put it together.
I once interviewed a poet who was an award-winning poet, and I think it was in his 90s, honestly. And, I asked him what it was like to be a poet and to have been so successful. And he said, well, it's this simple. A poem, it's like a dog with a bone. And then he waited a moment. He said, but I'm the bone, right? It's got me in its grips. And I feel like that with my own work sometimes, that I can't just turn it off. I can't just be like, oh, okay, well, it's time to have dinner. I'm still thinking about it really almost all the time.
So you discussed grit and how it plays out over time. You also showed grit actually seems to increase with age. Can you expound on that?
It's in my research, and as well in research from labs that are not mine, I think now around the world, that there is this positive correlation between grit and age in years. And so what you can learn from that causally, you have to say could it be culture? Could it be if you're born in the 60s, it's different than you're born in the 70s? Absolutely. But there is this maturity principle in psychology that does suggest that over time, people do, in many ways psychologically especially, get better and better. And I think that this positive correlation between grit and age could be an example of age and experience making you grittier. You figure out what your passions are. You learn to be resilient, and you develop the skill of working hard on things where you can improve. What's exciting to me, of course, is how to accelerate that development and not just wait for age and experience to do their magic.
And definitely purposeful practice moves us further than just the 10,000 hour rule, the 10,000 hour rule. And I have an interest in something called the jack of all trades, or from my military time, Recon Jack. That was our logo, and it was, as I looked at it, it was more of, there's so many little pieces of the puzzle we put together. None of us had the 10,000 hours, but we would parachute over the horizon, use a small boat to get closer in, get in on special scuba, dive in, do a mission, maybe demolition or weapons, go back out, meet a submarine. But each one of these had so many parts to it, and it's like we weren't an expert at any of those things, but putting it all together, we were good at that mission. So anyway, being a jack of all trades, is that exclusive to being someone who's gritty?
Well, I will say that when I think about jack of all trades, one thing to say is that, many people, when they think about what it means to be excellent at what they do, there's so many parts of what they do. I mean, any leader can say that for sure, right? It's not just one thing, it's many things. But what makes them, I think, not jack of all trades in the sense that it's often meant is that, those things are adding up to some larger project, right? What I think is, not useful for people who want to become excellent is when they completely change projects, where they're like, oh, I want to be an artist, and 6 months later they want to be a dentist, and then 6 months later they want to be something totally different. But once you do commit to something, of course there are going to be a lot of components to that thing, that project that you want to accomplish. And absolutely, mastery is trying to get at all of the parts.
I guess instead of jack of all trades, I should have said proficient in several things.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things about grit. I know that, some of the speakers for Parker seminars have emphasized, and I agree, you have to race your strengths, right? So absolutely. But at the same time, I will say, if your performance has many elements, right, and there are many components of what you do, you can't neglect your weaknesses either, right? You have to race your strengths, but also you do have to train and practice to improve your weaknesses.
Purposeful practice.
Yes, well, you know a lot about this, and so I will say, President Morgan, that the honor I had to work with Professor Anders Ericsson all the way up until his final days, I would say that, one thing that very few people know is that Anders would make very nuanced distinctions between different kinds of practice. The highest quality practice, he said, was deliberate practice. It almost always had, by definition, had a coach or a teacher. I think purposeful practice, he would also say, is a high quality practice. The bar was a little lower because you didn't necessarily have to have a teacher who was directing you.
So you spoke today, and actually several of our speakers just seemed like they blended together. Like I was talked yesterday about the study showing that physicians become worse as they get older. They're practicing evidence-based care the best the day they graduate from residency.
Interesting.
Throughout their entire life, unless they make a purposeful effort.
Commitments of continuous learning. Yeah.
So, and you kind of alluded that certain things you get worse and of course, Dr. Anders Ericsson talks about people certainly get worse with time if they don't really put in purposeful practice, meaningful practice. Don't just play the guitar, but stretch yourself. And I think you uncovered that a little bit today, too.
I really, truly believe that we can learn every day of our lives. It's a choice that we make, Are you going to stop learning when you get a certain degree, or are you going to commit yourself to be a continuous learner? I think, if you ask me what was Anders Ericsson like as a person, he had, I can't remember how many books he had in his house at his desk. Like, I think it was something like, I could be like 80,000 books. I think this was a man who not only studied this kind of continuous learning for your whole life, but he embodied it himself. And honestly, those are my favorite people, people who are learning every day.
That's a good goal to have. So you talked a lot today about culture, and you mentioned that the Finnish had a special word for grit, or that
sisu. Sisu is their word. Yeah.
And there's certain people groups tend to have a culture of being more resilient. We hear about the greatest generation. They seem to be a pretty tough group. Are they more resilient than subsequent generations?
A lot of people have asked, since the greatest generation, have we kind of slid downhill culturally in grit? And of course, a lot of people look at very, young people today and sort of wonder. I don't know, because I don't have a time machine. I really wish I did, so I could really directly compare. But I think what often gets missed in these conversations is, what's your microculture? Who are the 4 4 people that you spend the most time with? What group of professionals do you speak to? We can talk about the culture of the 1960s, the 50s, the years that we're in now. We could talk about one country versus another. But I think one of the most profound decisions that any person can make as a performer is to deliberately choose the microculture, where they work, where they live, who they spend the most time with. And that is at a different scale. But I think that's the most meaningful group of people that you will then begin to resemble, because that's the power of culture. We end up looking like, acting like, talking like the people around whom we spend time.
Like Jim Rohn would say, that you become like the 5 people you spend the most time with.
I think there's a lot of wisdom to that, and actually this has been shown across every society, from the most primitive to the most modernized, that no matter what is going on, you bend to the 5 people or to the closest people around you.
So in your talk, you also spoke about, there was a question you asked, you finish the things you start.
Finishing what you begin. Later, there was a question that was asked actually privately, after I got off stage, and it was whether, a son of somebody, like, she was asking, the mom was asking, like, should he quit football, right? And I thought to myself, like, I can't make that decision here, but I will say this. I know that the temptation to quit things is there because everybody has felt it, including me. I do think there is something about finishing a commitment, right? I'm not saying that people never pivot. I wouldn't make that advice. But I do think that when you're in the middle of a commitment, that, I taught my own daughters that, you finish your commitment. You signed up for a season.
You're there for
You're there for the season. Yeah.
That's good advice. So along those lines, last time we spoke, you said you were working on your second book.
I am.
How's that going?
Hard. Oh gosh, it is so hard. I am on my 3rd draft, and I think there will be 4 drafts, so there's just one more to go. But I'll tell you what it's about. It doesn't have a title yet. I wish I could tell you. But I think after understanding, the mindsets and the habits of high performers, and understanding, what's inside their head, I have become increasingly interested in the environments in which they place themselves that help put those, positive thoughts and those effortful actions to work. And I really truly believe in the power of culture. I believe in the power of mentors. I believe in the power of peers. I basically believe that the environments in which we put ourselves is one of the things that determines those, those mindsets and those habits. So this book is about the environments of high performers.
As we raised our children, we've always said that more is caught than taught. Your father said one thing, but he lived something else. Is that why you think you're gritty?
I have to say that even though my dad lectured me about talent and made comments about my very, very, bright relatives and all that, he embodied grit. He was so passionate about his work. He was so persevering. So I absolutely believe that in so many ways, the lessons that we teach are by example. And what I learned from my father's example has stuck with me my whole life.
That's wonderful. One of the questions she had was about someone who felt privileged that she might have been
First question.
Yeah, it was first question. And,
Yeah.
and she felt that she might not have had grit. And I don't think that's true. I think in some ways, like when I was in the military, I was in special operations, and there was people from wealthy homes in our unit. And there was other people from very impoverished homes. And each of them came forward and they displayed grit. And I looked at the one person, his dad was the wealthiest person in the town he came from. I think he saw in his father the grit it took to become wealthy and wanted to prove himself in the Marine Corps.
No, I don't think that you could say that there's any zip code in the United States or anywhere else where, you won't find grit. I mean, I don't think it's something that, oh, well, if you have too much money, you can't have grit. Or if you don't have a lot of money, you can't have grit. I think really the possibility that any of us could develop these, these attitudes and these habits is there. And I am not saying that these other factors don't matter in your eventual success. But if I've learned anything from studying paragons of grit is that they really do come from all different backgrounds. And I think they are all focused on their futures and where they are going, maybe more than, where they came from.
And they're really pursuing the long game. You talk about mindset and longevity. In your research, does a gritty mindset relate to longevity at all and life satisfaction?
I know that grit and life satisfaction are correlated. And of course, there's a lot of science, and I think it's really exciting science on how life satisfaction, being happy, being a positive person emotionally, how that predicts longevity. That's one of the, I think, most exciting findings in psychology, is that not only is your quality of life better while you're living it, you get more years of life as well. My advisor, Marty Seligman, is the founder of positive psychology. And so I will say that I've connected grit to happiness, and there's separate research connecting happiness to longevity. I have not yet done a study on grit and longevity.
So, and we're real interested in human performance, and we're creating a human performance center, and we're really pursuing that. How does grit affect human performance, just in general?
I mean, I think the exciting thing about human performance is, the possibility that people can intentionally improve their performance, that it's not just luck of the cards, good genetics or things beyond your control. And I guess if you ask me like what my deeper philosophy is, I think if you understand something, you will be better at managing it or optimizing it. So if you understand what human performance is, you should be better at optimizing it. And so that's to me the excitement as a scientist.
And Anders Ericsson talks about certain people, they have the gift, but they also have the right nurture. Mozart had perfect pitch, and he had a father who started teaching him at age 3. How does that play? Was Mozart a gritty person, or was he just somebody who was lucky?
I think Mozart is used in an article that Anders Ericsson wrote for the Harvard Business Review called The Making of an Expert. And if I'm not mistaken, Mozart is the very end of the article. And he uses Mozart as an example of someone who, if you just listen to the music and, you hear things like, wow, Mozart was really young when he composed his first symphony. And so that you immediately think like Mozart was just genetically different from everybody else. But I think Anders wants to use Mozart as an example of somebody who, when you look into the real biographical details, was actually precociously spending those thousands of hours of hard practice to do what he did. So I know Anders well enough to say that he would always emphasize the practice element of the story, because for him, he thought that we sometimes are too quick to label someone as, oh, they're just a gifted prodigy and like that's how they did everything. Behind all that mastery is always thousands of hours of high quality practice.
Well, he had, in his book, he talks about Mozart having perfect pitch, and then he had a father who was a music teacher who dropped everything to pour himself into Mozart with all these instruments. So it was perfect pitch is one in every 10,000 people has that. So there's millions of people who have perfect pitch, but he had the father at the right age at the right time.
When you bring up this, story of Mozart and his father, who, there may have been some complications there, but still, there's so many athletes too who have, from a very early age had this like kind of optimal environment for learning. That's really what my second book is about. Like, yes, people have enormous potential. Now let's figure out what the optimal conditions are, the environments in which we can grow the most.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I had such a warm Parker welcome, and I look forward to seeing you again.
We look forward to it as well. You've been listening to Dr. Angela Duckworth, and this is Parker University.